don't buy this whole idea that the people who are putting this legislation forward are valid representatives of the trans community. That's what they say they are. We have mechanisms for deciding whether someone's a valid representative of a community, and that generally involves democratic voting. I've received at least 20 letters from transsexual people who are on my side, and by the way, 0 from others, believe it or not, who are perfectly happy with the idea of gendered pronouns. It's just they want to be the other one. Now, you can have a discussion about that, and there's lots of things to be said about it, but the idea that this community that's coming out and demanding these rights is somehow representative of this homogenous, oppressed minority, I think is rubbish.
For this question, I'm going to ask both Professor Kosman and Professor Bryson to comment on it. So one of the objectives of the transgender and queer rights movement is to enter into public conscience in a way. And this person asks, this can only occur through public conversation. Do you worry that it may not be possible to have thoughtful discussion if there is government restriction about this kind of speech? And do you worry that it would skew discussion in one direction or another? So perhaps Professor Kosman first, and then Professor Bryson.
I think that there is an important way to have public discussions around a whole range of issues. I would welcome a discussion on the role of hate speech provisions. I would welcome a discussion around the role of hate speech and its desirability, about whether the Supreme Court of Canada is right or not right in upholding its constitutionality. But I would like to have that debate with someone who is knowledgeable about the law.
Thank you. And Professor Bryson.
One of the big questions that I had to deal with in considering whether or not to accept the very generous offer, invitation of the University of Toronto to come here today would be the impact of this event on trans and gender non-binary people, specifically at the University of Toronto and much more generally. And so, whereas I would say that I recognize practices of peer review, and practices of peer review are not denouncement. Practices of peer review are practices that we utilize to make assessments about knowledge claims, whereas I would fully appreciate being able to enter into a discussion about gender and gender identity and issues around trans culture as a means of practicing peer review. I think the difficulty that we've had, and we've managed to reproduce this difficulty here today, characterized just now by Dr. Peterson as simplifying the world for functional purposes. Simplifying the world for functional purposes is not what I recognize to be academic practice. This is not how we relate to knowledge. And so I think that there's a concern when we don't subject claims that are being made as knowledge claims by people who carry titles at great Canadian universities, when we don't treat those knowledge claims in the same way that we would in any other field. And when they're knowledge claims made about members of minority groups, embattled, vulnerable, marginalized members of minority groups, then I think that we all need to be very concerned about how it is that we're changing what we think we do in the university, which is supposed to be about the advancement of knowledge and excellence.
Thank you. Is Professor Peterson, as a clinical psychologist, refusing to acknowledge how damaging it could potentially be to an individual to disregard their identity?
It's a very difficult question to even engage with because I don't understand it. It makes things so simple that you can't discuss them properly. All I do in my clinical practice, and I have about 20,000 hours of experience in my clinical practice, and I've dealt with all sorts of people, far more variation in people than the typical person ever encounters, and I think I've done it at least reasonably, competently. All my discussions with people in my clinical practice are about their identity, given the definition of identity that I brought forth, how they feel about themselves, how they conceptualize themselves, because those are two different things, how that plays out in their interactions with other people, and what the functional significance of that is. And I'm going to say forthrightly, well, two things. One is that I don't believe that any of my clients have had cause to worry about my interpretation of their identity, because what I do in my practice is help them discover what that is. I'm seriously not interested in imposing any ideas of identity onto someone, because I can't do that. I don't know what the right vehicle is for you to travel through life. What I can help you do is articulate your concerns. I can ask you questions where I see contradictions in your self-articulation. I can help you make plans for the future. And I've helped thousands and thousands and thousands of people, by the way, make plans for the future with the stuff that I do online. And so I'm helping people build a genuine identity. And that's what I do. So that's the answer to that question, and I think I do it well. I mean, in stuff we've done from a research perspective with the Future Authoring Program, which I offered to people free a week and a half ago to help them catalyze their identities, we've helped 5,000 university students increase their grade point average 20% and decrease their dropout by the same. And the biggest effect has been with men and non-Western ethnic minority students who've accelerated their performance up beyond the range of the normal for the dominant culture. A pure psychological intervention, I might say, and not a sociological intervention. So I'm perfectly willing to stack my record on identity formulation up against anyone's. And I should also point out that I think where I'm most vulnerable in this entire debate, and I expect this will happen, and there's already been noise about it on the Ontario Psychological Association website, I think they'll probably come after my clinical license. So that'd be my guess. So
I think we might be straying a little away from the question now. So thank you.
No, we're not, because that question involved my clinical practice. I'm not straying a bit. That involved my clinical practice, and there was a reason that the question was posed. So I'm not straying.
Thank you. Why do you feel that someone's personal gender identity and pronouns infringes your free speech? Can one not also argue, based on your interpretation, that professors can use racial slurs in their classroom and that the inability to do so would violate their freedom of speech?
Well, that's pretty much the same question, I think. I think that we're crossing a dangerous line, and the line is the requirement that's being put upon people by government agencies with the full force of the law behind them to decide what language categories you're going to use. When I opened this debate, this forum, I tried to explain what this is about, and I couldn't explain everything that it's about because it's about too many things. But one of the things it's about is ideology and the distinction between the left and the right, and let's say. Now, I truly believe that these made-up pronouns, of which there are many, dozens, in fact, and there's no consensus on them.
I was just going to ask if you could go back to the point about the analogy between the racial slur and the
I don't think there's any analogy at all.
But that's
I think
what
the difference
people
between
hear you
I'm
on.
talking about compelled speech. There's a difference between saying that there's something you can't say and saying that there are things that you have to say. And I regard these made-up pronouns, all of them, as the neologisms of radical PC authoritarians. Do you understand that? And I'm not a fan of that sort of person. And the reason I'm not a fan of that sort of person is because I've done my homework. I've read everything I can get my hands on in the development of authoritarian political systems, and I know the literature inside out and backwards. And I am not going to be a mouthpiece for language that I detest. And that's that.
But from your perspective as someone who's also had a senior leadership role, as well as being an expert in the area, do you have any thoughts or guidance about what universities can do to ensure that we're moving things forward in a helpful, inclusive way?
Let's talk about apologies. So this week we heard from Justin Trudeau's government about the apology that will be made to LGBTQ Canadians concerning the extraordinarily violent impacts of discriminatory activities that were also research activities happening at Canadian universities and elsewhere to locate and to fire LGBT Canadians from the public service and from the RCMP. And let's pay attention to some of the details of that situation. You can Google the fruit machine, an incredibly bogus apparatus that was created, let's say not coincidentally, by a psychologist at Carleton University, Dr. Wake, who was the chair of the psychology department, intended only to identify supposed homosexuals who then would be fired from government service and from the RCMP. If we fast forward to the fairly recent past, we could look at CAMH making an apology for the incredibly damaging work carried out by Zucker in his bogus conversion therapy based entirely on these ideas about sex producing gender constancy, which then in the case of gender diverse young people could be cured by means of conversion therapy. CAMH had to apologize to the Canadian public and to Ontarians for the harms carried out by Dr. Zucker. And so I think that we might need to think about two things at the University of Toronto. And one would be an apology for any damages to the right to safety and the right to humanity on the part of trans and gender diverse people at the university and in the great city of Toronto more generally. And then, of course, the University of Toronto also, and perhaps it already is, and I'm sure you know more about this than I do, could implement